Chapter 14 Turn of the Tides.
When the master returned, it seemed the whole of the kingdom stood still. And being in his company for all those weeks, returning to Archaea felt to me like descending into a cave. Town after desolate and war-wrecked town, faces were all downturned as we approached and then uplifted at the sight of Master Paen. Crowds developed and soon the warriors fell in line behind us. Messengers shot ahead of us to prepare for Paen's way. Every preparation was made for him, humble homes open to him, and yet, when after many days of travel we approached the Archaean gates, we were only reluctantly allowed to pass. As we entered my father's court, I was struck by the feeling in the room, an awful contradiction to the splendorous decor. It seemed so small to me now, almost laughable. A mouse hole. It was emptied of wisdom and instead crowded with reactive bodies on large cushions. My father was visibly in anguish, but nevertheless he maintained a faint aura of the highest and yet unwarranted sense of self-esteem that obstructed the flow of his real freedom. I could see it now with new perspective. I gasped in that moment, having realized now in Paen's company I had completed a cycle with him. I had traveled away from Archaea in search for him and was now returning with him to look upon my father with different eyes. Upon my reflection, it occurred to me how Minot traveled in the same way with Master Paen as part of his work. He was freeing us. "You," the master said, looking at my father. Then he circled a pointed finger around the room at the chiefs and warlords who were discussing the fate of two armies sent to the north. "You have created chaos in my land. You slice up the world with your silly designs, only interested in the divinity that justifies your means and protects your investments. You all overlook the primary, only real, only sane investment. You throw it away as soon as a sacrifice is demanded, as soon as a feather is ruffled." My father swallowed and lowered his eyes. He was obviously startled to see Paen before him. "Well, time is running out," the master said as he looked about the entirety of the room. No one dared speak against him. "It will not be long before most of these leeches, in one manner or another, turns their sword against your precious Archaea. Soon, you will all be greedily fighting to establish new territories as the idea of Archaea fades from your minds, overshadowed by little kingdoms within little kingdoms. Do what you want. I'm done with it." "How dare he?" was scrawled on the stern faces of those gathered. And the chatter through the hall was like a thick smoke, making the eyes burn and the head ache. The master quickly left the room and he returned with a fat pouch in his hand. The warlords, lower chiefs and warriors, mayors and merchants continued in their political and business matter mutterings. My father sat on the throne, seemingly paralyzed. The master held the pouch in the air then, and overturning it, dropped the contents of it onto the clay floor. The sound of metal filling onto the floor chimed, quieting my father's mob. The master emptied the bag slowly, the contents bouncing, clinking, and rolling about. Bronze-colored objects half a finger's length and cylindrical in shape. One rolled before Darlian. My brother picked it up and sniffed one end. Fire. His mouth shaped the word. My father leaned from his chair and picked one up as well. The crowd was silent. I know your days are numbered because I've seen it. The power to create peace is no longer yours. Now here comes the whirlwind. You are wedded to this destiny I see now, the master yelled at my father, who seemed high on opium. Master, a voice called from the second row of onlookers. What is this? Your beloved 7th and 9th legions are not coming back, and this is why. It will not be long before this fire weapon is common among Mayak, the master said. But there's more. Then we must get this weapon for ourselves, a voice interrupted, and the court was again incensed. Paen nodded. Yes. Yes. I thought you would say this. He left, and I left with him, and we would not return again, I knew. The master left behind the life he knew in Archaea, and left Khoorhani to it. Let us go, Jeshibian. We rode to the east several miles, and Darlian followed, and behind him, Sasojeda and Banwido. A certain edge came over me. Being now in Darlian's company, I still could not look at him directly, and I gave him marginal regard. I knew I was disobeying Paen, but I could not seem to help it. However, it was not long before Paen, having a sense of everything, took our minds off ourselves. We entered the dark of the forest, with only the master's single torch to guide us. After several hours of following Paen and his hurried pace, we came to a tree-covered hill overlooking another expanse of trees. There was a tangibly bright feeling of openness here. The master dismounted Khoorhani and walked into the thick jungle. We followed him on foot to an area with few trees where he suddenly stopped. I bumped into his back. Here, he said, then abruptly turning to me, he grinned, and his eyes flashed. He then flashed his eyes at Darlian sweetly. Darlian and I looked at one another, wondering what he meant. Build it here, he said, and then whirled in a circle, excitedly. Clear all of this, and build me a dish. Here, right now. And so, Darlian and I spent the entire evening clearing away the jungle plants. We had no choice but to work together and forget ourselves. The following days were spent digging with the shovels Darlian went back to Archaea to retrieve along with other supplies. We broke our backs, the four of us, creating an impressive bowl in the jungle floor, mixing the clay for a floor, and building a frame out of tied bamboo and tree logs. Until it was done, we slept beneath the stars, away from the madness that was Archaea. Darlian and I then began to speak to one another. The master beamed brightly, happily, and commanded us to rebuild all bridges of our love, inspiring us to finish. When the structure was done, beloved Paen clapped his hands. Very beautiful, he said as he walked into the entryway of his new dish, our new home. Darlian traveled back to Kushaiti, back to his wife and his post and service to the Ta, our father. He was caught, unable to let the old way go. Paen kissed him, held him, and said to return to him. Darlian seemed haunted by ghosts. I knew my cold-heartedness, my distance had contributed to Darlian's malaise. I tasted the subtle sweetness of vengeance. The other half of his malaise, I knew, came from the battlefield, but I refused to help him heal. And instead, in my coyness, I listened, entertained by his stories of the war. Though Minot successfully defended Kamana, Katik had fallen, conquered by Unat Mayak, Darlian told us. Their new guns, the weapons Paen spoke of, decimated our legions in the east. The tides had certainly shifted. Then there was even more disturbing news. In the west, the regrouped wolf riders, greatly enhanced in numbers, overran Tanaga and ousted Lord Shakuba, who fled to my father's gates with a message. Soon, father, we shall meet. They were led by Botaj. Darlian trembled in the telling of the story of how our brother was now our enemy. Compelled to visit Arkaya one final time, Paen traveled back, accompanied by Sasojada, Banwido, Darlian, and me. My father looked worn, sapped by this war. Minot did well to care for him, but it was my father's time, and it would take this for Paen, Khoorhani Ta's brother in all actuality, to set foot in his gates ever again. I saw that Khoorhani Ta did not have many years left to him, if that. Paen wanted me to witness it, and it would not be long before Minot would inherit my father's crown, along with the age-old war, now against his own brother. Paen prepared me in this way for the day that my father, the Ta of all Khoorhani, died. It was his brother Tomak who found him, the life gone out of him, sitting on his throne. We mourned him, burned his body, and scattered the ashes at the great waterfall where his brother, Khalid, died. Paen told me that my father's debt was enormous. He said that peace fostered by my father's will was an impossible feat for Khoorhani Ta to actually achieve because of his karmic debt. Paen revealed to me that the price of Khalid's death, Paen's previous incarnation, could only be absorbed by my father's first 5 sons. I was free, Paen told me. He impressed upon me the importance of why I should obey him, for the work to free me from the madness of Arkaya could be undone. Minot was now Ta of the Khoorhani nation. The day of his coronation seemed dark, stormy as the winds howled and entered into my father's court that was now Minot's. The master and I left. I knew then that it would be the last time Paen would ever set foot beyond those gates. I was not sure about myself, and that troubled me. As I sat with my brother Darlian at the falls where our father's ashes were spread, I traced my doubt to the source. I had not obeyed Paen. Something remained of my anger, and beneath my politeness to him I felt it. I had not forgiven Darlian. Though we had traveled much together since the day he killed Ursia, we had not spoken one word about it. Knowing that Botage and Minot still had much between them that was unresolved, I could feel my clinging to a latent sense of anger, the intensity, a spare few degrees from hating Darlian. And yet I could sense Paen nearby watching us and showing me that my choice to not forgive Darlian was the very seed of this total war. I had to obey or disobey Truth's champion, my master, Paen. I had to choose. I sensed that Darlian knew too, and we both hung on the edges in avoidance. We sat on a rocky ledge as the flow of the river dropped downward and sent up white mist. Paen, again by his grace, framed this moment for me. It was important that I obey him. It was important that no fragment of self stand in the way of love. It was important if I were ever to escape the destiny of following my father's course. And so, with this test before me, I clenched my fist as I saw that day again, it reeling before my mind's eye, the shadow of an arrowhead against my Ursia's whiteness of snowfall, and I felt my clenched fist begin to open, letting it go. I began to open my mouth. Jeshibian. Darlian spoke before I could. I have wanted to speak with you. It was as if by opening my hand, my heart, I allowed him to confess. I flung my arms around him before he could finish, and just said, I forgive you, Darlian. I'm sorry. I forgive you. I have been so haunted by my deeds. I remember the day so clearly. I've killed men on the field, and yet I cannot shake how awful that day was for me. He said, and in your silence I only expected us to grow more apart, and you never forgiving me and me never confessing my deep remorse. I clutched him as we sat dangerously on the ledge, unconcerned with the danger of falling together where the former master was killed by my father's careless act of jealousy. I am sorry, Darlian. I've held to my anger like some pitiful dark pearl. I know she did not want that for me. My heart is open to you, Darlian. It has been hard, but I forgive you. And I love you, brother. How can you? He seemed to shrink, to crumple in grief as he cried. With as much love as I can muster, I replied, for that is Paen's way. We cried a moment, then sat in quiet observance of the sunlight shifting behind distant clouds. Tell me everything about my sister-in-law, Darlian said, and I did. We sat for hours as I told him about Ursia, her quickness, her wry humor, and the fact that I taught her all I had learned about archery from Darlian. He smiled, though with a marked measure of pain in his expression. We rose to hike back a half-mile, following the river to where our mares were tied. We crossed the river, along the rocks where Khalid and our father used to spar, and we ran the dusty trail along the winding river. Darlian updated me on the war. He told me that Minot, Khoorhani Ta, had secured rifles from the plainsmen who had sold them to the Mayak. They had thousands of them, Darlian remarked. Yes, but who did the plainsmen get them from?
Oh, you know, Joshoya, the only answer you'll get from a plainsman is that it was the gods.
Right. Just then, I heard a terrible rumbling. It was like the sound of the largest herd of animals coming our way. Dar, I said. He did not notice the sound. The sound triggered a fear in me like a wild bird that knows when the volcano is about to blow. Dar! I shouted, but he kept walking ahead of me, and the sound seemed to transcend logic, as it felt to be nearly on top of us and not about to run at us from the woods, but to fall literally from the sky. Dar! Then Darlian heard it. Instinctively, I ran over to him, the sound getting louder than life and death itself. It screamed like a million banshees in flight. I tackled Darlian and we slid into the wet dirt along the embankment. I felt the weight of it pressing the air, whatever it was. The heat as it passed over us, quickly. It was large, fast, heavy, and on fire. Darlian trembled and yelled in terror. I watched the fireball skid up the river along the water, sending up spray with force. Then it skidded against the shore, ripping a large track into the firmament and breaking apart into the trees that it destroyed along the way. Darlian was screaming still, and I covered his mouth. He calmed down, but his eyes were alight and his body still trembled. After the terrible boom, the rumbling subsided and it was again quiet, only the hollering of monkeys and screeching of birds in the distance. Over the treetops in the distance was a large plume of smoke. Darlian got up to run. "A demon! We must go, Joshoya!" "Wait!" I exclaimed. "No, there's no waiting, idiot! Please, let's get out of here!" I rose, coughing from the acrid smoke in the air. I was afraid, but felt fully prepared to meet this. I had to see it through. "Stay here," I said to Darlian. "Joshoya, now is not the time for foolishness. Ashuta's angry at me for laughing at her." I laughed, thinking him most exaggeratedly dramatic. Darlian then began to laugh at himself. "What the hell was that?" "I mean," Darlian laughed again. "This is not about us, Dar. I think I dreamed this," I said. "Well, did we survive in your dream?" Darlian retorted. I slowly crossed the stream, alarmed that the temperature of the water was tangibly warmer. Darlian followed. We crossed the river and came to the giant ditch dug into the ground. I marveled at the strange chunks of debris left along the fireball's trail. The smell of the jungle being baked assaulted my nostrils as we timidly moved along. The birds and monkeys offered up an insane cacophony in the background. We then came to a clearing where the trees were obliterated, and from behind a small brush that was spared, we hid and could see it. I never before in my life imagined anything like it. Only witnessed it in a dream, but I knew it was an exquisite machine. Joshoya, that's like a like an air carriage. A craft, I said, remembering the Kwa peoples in the south and their airships that utilized balloons. Yes, but where's the balloon? Darlian wondered. It's not a Kwa ship. You don't have to tell me that. The craft was sleek, made of steel and beige in color, and pieces of it were scattered all about with strange writing on them. I went to move in closer, much to Darlian's displeasure, but I had to get closer. It was magnificent. I waved for Darlian to approach, and as he did, we heard a sound from it. It seemed to be turned on its side. The dark canopy at what looked to be the front slid open. We heard someone coughing. The pilot struggled to get out. He dangled his lower half outside and seemed to be searching for something in the interior. He freed it. It was a child. It was strange looking and seemingly unperturbed by the upheaval. The stranger staggered out to plain view, coughed as he held the child in one arm. He saw us and obviously felt threatened because he then pointed a weapon, not unlike a rifle but more sophisticated. It was shorter, made for one hand to grasp. Black, smooth, and oblong, with a wide, yellow, menacing opening. Darlian and I put our hands up. He did not seem terribly frightened of us and only wanted us to leave him alone, as if he had more pressing matters to tend to. Still, he pointed his weapon and seemed to swoon. His gun trembled in his hand as he held it. He wore a strange, shiny black helmet from which black cables hung. The man put the child down and struggled to remove his headpiece. When he did, Darlian and I were shocked to see his odd face. It was pinkish and white, his ears blunted with round ends. The man inhaled laboriously, and then he frantically searched his black one-piece garment for something. He found the search-for object in one of the many pockets and exposed an end of it by removing a cap. It was needle-tipped, and frantically the stranger tore away the fabric on his leg, exposing white skin. He wheezed, coughed, and then stabbed himself with the needle while pressing the other end with his thumb. He shook violently, sighed in relief, and then seemed to breathe better. His eyes were irritated and watery. He then said a word to us, tried to compose himself, his weapon shaking more rapidly. He then fell to the ground, unconscious. The child sat by him. She lightly smacked at the white man's face. She was just as strange, her skin bluish-black and intricately patterned like a fish or a reptile. She frightened me by her exotic appearance, but then she began to cry in her humanness. She needed help, needed comfort. They both needed help. I went to her and picked her up, and she stopped crying. She was marvelous. Darlian could not shut his mouth, which gaped open as he looked on. "I told you we'd be fine," I said, holding the baby girl who dropped from the sky and marveling at her long jet-black hair and iridescent skin.
Part 2. Sten. Chapter 15. The Seed.
Darlian backtracked and found his Mera, white mane, then rushed home. I told him not to go to the palace, but to the master. Only Paen would know what to do. The pale man remained unconscious, lying on the grass stretched out, as I watched the girl child. I noticed a rash on the back of the stranger's shoulder where he had been struck by a poisoned dart. By the pattern of the welts, I knew it would work best as a remedy, and had much of what I needed in Nanui's saddlebags. Though the stranger's own antidote saved him from suffocating to death, the poison could still decay his flesh, so I quickly worked hard to save the man's arm. At times, the baby girl cried. She was no doubt hungry, and I nervously tended to her. She was so foreign to me. Her eyes, solid black orbs, and her teeth, tiny and fanged. Her skin, dark and beautifully patterned. Still, I picked her up as she reached for me. She quieted. She was gentle, and the loveliest being I've ever seen. She was warm in no real way what I could sense, cold-blooded. I suddenly and quite naturally felt myself to be her protector as I held her to me. She looked up at me, smiling. A baby, just a baby, I told myself reassuringly. Not knowing where her gaze fell, I did not look fully into her eyes. I recognized my still prejudiced apprehension in this, but I soon felt her innocence taking me in. I fed her what I had. She seemed to like fruit. She rested her head against my shoulder. Just a baby, Jeshoya, just a baby, I told myself. The hours passed. When the master finally rode to the site, Darlian was with him, and the moons were high in the sky and lit the crash site. Paen, upon seeing the child in my arms, stopped dead. He then walked to us with his lantern held out before him. Visibly astonished, Paen then smiled at the baby. She laughed at the sight of him, and her arms reached out for him. Oh, my! Now just who do we have here? Paen inquired with obvious delight. A fallen star, I see. He laughed. He took her from me, and she flung her arms around him and giggled. He held her to him and looked deeply into her eyes, his forehead against hers, her dark, tiny hand against his cheek. He kissed her again and again as he held her. It was a marvelous show of recognition. They were happy to see each other as if they were reunited from some distant land. Paen then looked at the pale man on the ground. He walked over to him, examined him, and then looked around at the crash site. We will need to get them back to my home quickly before others see this mess, said the master. Should we clean this all up? Darlian asked. No, let it be for now. There's no need to hide anything, but we must get these two back to my home, Paen replied. When we returned to the master's dish, we stretched the pale man out on a bed that Darlian and I created out of hides. The master tended to the child and made a small bed for her. He fed her and told Darlian and I to do the same for the man. As we did, as the master said, we marveled at the look of this man. "Where do you think he's from?" I asked Paen. "Oh, I would assume from over the mountains east, far east beyond our known territories," Paen said. "Though I think his home might be a bit further than that." Paen was still quite captivated by the baby girl. She was unique to say the least. "Take care of him. He is not doing well at all. If he lives, I'm sure in time you will ask him where he's from and he will tell you," Paen said, the inflection indicating my service would be to Paen in caring for this man. I took that to mean that I should learn to speak the man's foreign words, a task that excited me. I served him remedies to help him heal from the poison. For days, the situation did not look good for the stranger, and I lost myself in obsessive vigilance over him, making sure he did not stop breathing and working to break his fever. Finally, after the fever broke, he awoke. When he did, I tended to him and helped to restore his strength. When awake, the stranger's eyes were like blue ice. His gaze was intense, but there was a charisma in him that I found inviting. He looked at me oddly, as if he somehow recognized me. Perhaps I reminded him of someone. He nodded his head in thanks for the soup, his gratitude expressed with a great smile, but his forehead broke out into sweat upon ingesting it. "I always told you used too many spices, Jeshibian," the master muttered, then returned to his meditation with the girl child. For hours, they sat together, silently. After a few more days, the stranger arose. When he stood, he swooned and held my shoulder. I guided him out of the master's dish and into the open air where the man sat on an old log and scanned the horizon with his icy gaze. He stripped his trunk of the black one-piece garment he wore, exposing his bone-white torso. The top piece of it hung along his backside. He removed his black rubbery shoes and tossed them aside. He gestured to me with his hands, inquiring the whereabouts of a box. He gestured the shape of one of his parcels, trying to describe it. "Wo ist mein Koffer?" he asked. "Es ist ein schwarzer Kasten." He added, his phrasing's odd to me, but nevertheless intriguing, like a strange music. Having a good memory of what we decided to bring back from the wreckage, I had a good idea of what he referred to. I fetched a black box from the pile of wares the master instructed us to bring back. I placed the box before him. He sighed and then grinned tiredly. Strands of his black stringy hair fell into his eyes. He pulled them backward to where their lens hung right above his shoulders. Darlian came out of the dish to have a look at what was going on. "Ah, Sensei, ein kluger Junge wunderbar," the man said with tones of affection. He opened the trunk, and from it he removed a heavy pair of black leather boots and dropped them to the ground. They were well made, and I admired them. He then changed out of his black garb and into a simple gray pair of pants and a billowy white shirt with long sleeves. He then sat on the black box and pulled his boots on. He then reached in and pulled out a small package, fumbled with its edges, and removed a long and thick-rolled object, holding it in the straight rows of his teeth. I was not sure I liked the strong smell of it. Tobacco. The stranger glanced at me with his blue eyes beneath his dark eyebrows and offered me one. I accepted. He pulled out a small silver metal object, square in shape, and abruptly shook it, making the top of it fling open, and in one motion of his thumb, he produced a flame. Darlian grinned, fixing his eyes on the contraption. Ja, ik dacht dat ze dat mochten. The stranger mused to himself as he placed the end of the cigar into the flame, then sucked from the other end of it. I noticed how he took pleasure in impressing us with his wares. He took the smoke into his mouth, then blew it out of his nose. He then handed me the cigar and gestured me to do the same, though warning me not to inhale. I did, and I coughed from the intensity of this strange tobacco, my eyes burning and watering. I knew these splendid little items would go over well with the chiefs and captains in my father's council room. I then felt a wince of pain upon remembering that my father was dead. The stranger slapped my back, laughing at me. Heaving, I handed the lighter to Darlian, who fumbled with it for some time before producing the flame. I continued to watch the stranger and imitated his smoking. I began to like him more as I placed the roll between my thumb and two fingers when bringing it to my mouth just as he did. The stranger, taking in his surroundings, seemed to relax. With his thumb, he dug at the corners of his eyes, removing the sleepers. He then snorted, and then spit. He dangled the burning cigar from between his bared teeth and searched for more objects in his trunk. Finding what he was searching for, he then gathered his jet-black hair back and tied it by a red strip of fabric into a neat bow at the back of his head. Darlian handed the stranger's silver lighter back to him. The man put his hand up and gestured for him to keep it. He patted his chest, then pointed to Darlian, indicating it was a gift. Danka, the man said. He then tossed me a pack of his cigars, assuming I liked them, and again said, Danka, his eyes piercing. He approached me squarely, making me nervous as he placed the smoking ember of the cigar between fingers, and with open palms, he grabbed my shoulders and gently shook me, saying, Ich schulde dir mein Leben. I was intrigued. I wished to know how to speak his language, and as the days progressed, we smoked more of his tobacco and exchanged more words. I learned that his name was Bren Edgewood. Bren Edgewood, I struggled. It was difficult to pronounce each other's names without laughing, and so to compromise, he would call me Josh, and I would call him Bren. He rose and stretched, and from his trunk, he removed a brown leather harness, which he fashioned around his shoulders, adjusting the loose shirt beneath it. Beneath his right armpit, an empty holster hung. Bren fixed his icy blue gaze on me and, with an arched eyebrow, inquired where his weapon got off to. He pointed an index finger out, his thumb up to illustrate. Darlian came back quickly with it in his hand. It was heavy-looking, shiny and black, nothing like the rusted rifle that belonged to Darlian. My brother was fascinated by the weapon. He returned it to Bren, and Bren quickly took it and returned it to its rightful place in his harness. Bren wished to return immediately to the crash site. Though sunset was upon us, he insisted. Once there, he began rattling instructions to me and motioning with his hands and arms. I could barely keep up with him. He wanted us to help push his craft over, but it was too heavy for the three of us. Frustrated, he smacked the side of the craft and uttered phrases that no doubt were curses. He was now full of energy, not at all the man who barely escaped his death by a poisonous dart of a plainsman. He seemed to move about with urgency, to continue on with whatever he was doing up to the moment he had dropped from the sky. He was on a mission, from what I could see. Darlian and I fastened our mares to his craft, attempting to tip it over, but Bren just waved his hand and indicated, "Never mind." He rummaged through the craft's compartment, mumbling to himself until he found what he was looking for. A slightly square object. Black, sleek, strange, just the same as everything else in his possession. He fumbled with it until it made some noises, whining and hissing. Bren spoke into it. "Falken ein Bergnest, hören Sie mich? Ich habe das Paket über," Bren said. Darlian and I looked on as he kept repeating the same phrase. "Falken ein Bergnest, hören Sie mich? Ich habe das Paket über. Antworten Sie auf mich." The device only continued to make the same sounds as Bren continued. "Falken ein Bergnest, hören Sie mich? Ich habe das Paket. Ich habe neue Koordinaten für Rendezvous. Bitte responde. Bitte responde." He listened for a response, but to no avail. The sun receded, and night was upon us. Darlian and I squatted next to a lamp that Bren removed from his craft. Darlian yawned as we watched the fireflies floating upward to the stars. I did the same, yawned, and then we smiled at each other. "What do you think that is?" Darlian said. "Antworten Sie auf mich, bitte, bitte." I scratched my head as I watched Bren speaking into his device. Some kind of messenger? Yes, but who will carry it? How does a message travel? Darlian asked. I threw up my hands, my eyes bulging at him. "He seems to be waiting to hear a voice at any time." We both grew tired. And soon, we could not fight off sleeping. "Falken ein Bergnest, hören Sie mich? Ich habe das Paket. Ich habe neue Koordinaten für Rendezvous. Bitte responde. Bitte responde." Falken ein Bergnest. I seemed to carry that phrase with me into the netherworld of slumber. I had no idea what it meant, only that by the growing tone of desperation in Bren's voice, he was a long way from home, now with no way back. "Falken ein Bergnest, hören Sie mich? Ich habe das Paket. Ich habe neue Koordinaten für Rendezvous. Bitte responde." I had a strange dream. I rose from where I was sleeping as if having awakened and walked several yards to where Bren's ship had crashed. I looked down into a burnt-out crater, 4 times bigger than the actual site. The ship was gone as if sunken deep within the charred dirt, a seed. Beneath the harsh glow of the moons, both full, I could see the most peculiar object in the dark center. It was the sweet, green leaves of a plant. It grew before my eyes and turned into a sapling tree. I grinned as I watched it expand. I awoke the next morning to the same phrase. "Falken ein Bergnest, hören Sie mich? Ich habe das Paket. Ich habe neue Koordinaten für Rendezvous. Bitte responde. Bitte responde." With a long sigh, Bren slumped against the hull of his broken vessel. His sleep-deprived face flushed, his hand held against his face, stroking his temples with his fingers. Then he snapped to his feet and violently threw the device into the woods. He stood a moment, his face red, conveying a sense of embarrassment for his rage as he tried to cool off. He then glanced at me, winked, and smiled, and ran after the device. From the woods I heard a cry. Scheiße! His howl was filled with a tone of regret. He brought the shattered pieces of the device back in his open hand. He then paced back and forth. Darlene was snoring, still asleep. Bren looked at me. Josh, Sie haben, he began, and he then drew shapes in the air, pointing to the mountains and drawing shapes in the sky all about him. Karten, maps. The word, map, he finally said in Kwa. Maps? I asked. Maps, yeah, maps. He pointed east, and I understood. While Darlian ventured back to Archaea, I focused on Bren. His language was like an intricate puzzle to me, and my focus in learning it was akin to the engaged and fascinated mind of a child at play. The master had always encouraged me to follow my impulse to unlock languages, saying that it was a good thing. Paen said I should listen carefully and try to feel beyond the veil of words, so the verbal aspects would flow to me easier. And so, Paen pushed me toward Bren, making me his advocate. Each night, Paen would ask me how it was coming along, and every morning he reminded me to listen deeply. And so I did. In a matter of days, I found myself daring to communicate with Bren in his own language, shamelessly stumbling over the words. Seeing my student zeal, Bren happily obliged and corrected me. But first, he wanted to talk about the land in Banish, his tongue. He wanted to know more about where he was. I took Bren, who took to mares quite naturally and was a more competent rider than I thought he would be, riding into the east. He was a rugged and stubborn sort of man, not easily shaken by anything, and he seemed to have sharp, wolf-like instincts. I was shocked to learn that he spoke Kwa rather fluently, a tongue known by most of the tribes of Ganaya and spoken by the plainsmen in the east. This made learning the Banish language much easier, but the fact that he knew the dialect intrigued me. Who was this man? How far east was the land of Bane? Bane is not a land, it's a planet, Josh, Brent said. The only word he could use to translate from Kwa was dream door or portal, but I could tell that the description was not right. Finally, he used the word for the moons to explain. I still did not get it. For the sun and the moon were divine objects to Khoorhani and Mayak. I realized that Bren, in his discomfort, was being careful not to describe himself as being a god. I took him up to several high ledges that Darlian and I used to travel to. We sat one afternoon in tall grasses and spied on Khoorhani youth, playing hand drums beneath tall trees. Bren grinned, seemingly quite taken by Archaea's beauty. On our return, we stayed hidden from the waves of Archaean legions passing, soldiers deployed to fortify the Khoorhani defensive in the east. Bren cocked one eyebrow at me and seeing their numbers pass as we avoided being seen. I told Bren all about the wars. He listened with a sharp attention. And your brother, Minot, is now king of Archaea? Yes. So, Botaj Ta was your father. Paen is not your father. No, Paen is my master, I answered. From our perch, we saw Darlian approaching from across the open field, returning from his errand from Archaea. We went to intercept him. When Darlian returned with the maps, we spread them over a flat rock outside of Master Paen's dish. Bren debated with me for hours over the best route he could take to the plains. To Bren's displeasure, I insisted on a route that ran deep to the south to avoid the war campaigns. Darlian, looking at the course, shook his head, his eyes wide with surprise that we were considering this route. Bren looked at me to explain Darlian's demeanor. "Tigers," I said to him. I then redrew a course. Bren shook his head, and his expression seemed to say he was not worried about tigers. "How long, Josh?" he asked. I held 2 palms out, extended my fingers, fluttering them twice. Bren acted as if he did not understand me, and he looked at me like a teacher looks at a student who has neglected his lessons. With one eyebrow arched over his spectacles, he prompted me. "Banish word." He then snapped his finger. "Quick." A smirk of a smile settled on his excited face. Zwanzig," I replied. He then fluttered both hands at me twice. "Yeah, 20, he said, saying the Qua word. He then shook his head in frustration and considering the number of days' travel to get back to Bergnist. "Any shorter route you can think of?" He struggled with the Khoorhani. "Shorter? No. Unless you wish to climb," I answered, pointing to the mountains in the east. "He'd get captured trying," Darlian muttered. I shook my head at Bren to make it clear this route was unsatisfactory. Bren was undaunted. He lit another cigar and began to ponder to put his plan together, despite my insistence of the dangers. "Tigers." He shrugged.